A poor girl hugs the wrong man. Turns out he's a millionaire with a broken heart. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below. The airport was packed, and tell us where you're watching from. With the chaos of arrivals. Rolling suitcases clattered across the floor, announcements echoed overhead, and the air was thick with emotion. Some joyful, some anxious. Emily stood quietly near the arrival gate, her posture tense but composed. Dark circles beneath her eyes told of sleepless nights. She was still in her event staff uniform from the gala she'd finished designing at sunrise, and the clipboard she clutched was now a useless prop in her nervous hands. Her younger brother was flying home from overseas treatment. After months of hospitals, bills, and fear, he was finally coming back. Her heart pounded as she scanned the crowd. And then she saw him. Tall, broad shoulders, jet black hair, familiar build. He walked with the same slight tilt of the head her brother always had. Without thinking, without breathing, she broke into a run. Her bag slipped from her shoulder as she charged through the crowd and threw her arms around him. "Oh my God, I missed you so much," she whispered, her voice thick with tears, cheek pressed to his chest. But something was off. The man stiffened. His scent was foreign, woodsy, expensive, almost too polished. His body didn't feel right either. Too firm, too composed. Slowly, Emily pulled back. And that's when she saw his face. It wasn't her brother. It was a stranger. No, not just any stranger. It was Lucas Grant, the reclusive billionaire behind LG Holdings. A man rarely photographed, known for avoiding publicity and shutting down interviews mid-sentence. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened in horror. I'm so sorry," she stammered. I didn't look. She turned and bolted, nearly tripping over a child's suitcase as she disappeared into the crowd. Lucas remained still. For a moment, his usually unreadable expression cracked, just slightly. Confused amusement flickered in his eyes as he adjusted his collar. He'd been hugged plenty of times in life, for status, attention, flattery. But this had been different. That girl hadn't hugged Lucas Grant, billionaire. She'd hugged a brother she missed, and that made it linger in his mind longer than he expected. 1 week later, the ballroom of the Grand Ellington Hotel was glowing under golden light. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above rows of velvet-covered tables. Classical music played in the background as staff moved like shadows. Silent, efficient. Emily stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, making final adjustments to the floral arrangements for tonight's high-profile charity gala, funded by none other than LG Holdings. This event was the kind she excelled at. Silent beauty behind the scenes, crafting elegance that others would take credit for. No one noticed the woman in the dark blazer adjusting the flowers, but Emily didn't need them to. Her art was in the details. She leaned over the VIP table, carefully turning a white orchid just so, when a low, familiar voice cut through the hum of the room behind her. This time, "Are you greeting me with flowers instead of a hug?" She froze. A chill ran down her spine. She turned, slowly, and there he was. Lucas Grant. He looked every bit as composed as she remembered. Sleek black suit, crisp white shirt, calm, unreadable gaze, but this time, he was smiling, a real smile, subtle, warm. Emily blinked, unsure whether to be mortified or amused. "You're here," she managed. Lucas casually took a seat at the table she had just finished preparing. "Apparently, as the main sponsor, I was expected to make an appearance. I figured I might as well sit at the prettiest table in the room." Emily didn't know what to say. She busied herself with a napkin that didn't need adjusting, her fingers suddenly clumsy. Lucas watched her in silence, not judging, not mocking, just observing. And she had no idea that since the airport incident, he had found out everything about her. Emily Hart, event designer, mid-level, hard-working, no press, no scandals, no reason for a man like him to remember her. Except, he did. Since that day, Lucas had quietly ensured that every event hosted by LG Holdings would be contracted to her company. And at every event, somehow, Emily would be there. And he would be watching from the shadows, or from the nearest table. At first it was coincidence, then it became something else. A few days later, at a product launch event, Emily spotted him again, talking to executives, wearing the same disarming smile. She ducked into a side hallway, but when she turned a corner, he was already standing there. "Are you following me now?" she asked, trying to keep it light. Lucas shrugged. "I was curious if you'd hug another stranger," Emily chuckled despite herself. It slipped out unguarded, and Lucas noticed it was the first time he'd seen her smile like that. And for some reason, he wanted to see it again. Something was happening. Neither of them had spoken it aloud. But every time their eyes met across a crowded room, there was something unspoken, undeniable, growing in the quiet. It wasn't about wealth, it wasn't about the past, it was about something real, and neither of them was ready to admit it yet. It was nearly 9 p.m. when the last guest left the ballroom. The grand piano had stopped playing, the lights dimmed to a soft golden hue, and the clinking of glasses had faded into distant memory. Emily remained, crouched near the entrance, arranging the final decorative crates for pickup. The soles of her feet throbbed in her heels, and her eyes burned from a long day that had begun before dawn. But none of that compared to the weight pressing down on her chest. Her phone had buzzed earlier with a message from the hospital. Oliver's condition had worsened. Her younger brother, her everything, needed immediate intervention. A new treatment. One she could never afford. And now, she had run out of options. That's when she saw him. Lucas was still there, standing at the far end of the now empty ballroom, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a wine glass untouched. He wasn't looking at the chandeliers or the art. He was watching her. Emily stood, hesitated, then walked past him toward the exit, hoping he wouldn't say anything. But he did. "Stay a moment." She stopped. Lucas took a few steps closer. His voice was calm, measured, but his eyes, gray, steady, were softer tonight. "I heard about your brother." Emily stiffened. "I didn't tell anyone." "You didn't have to," he said gently. "I've seen that look in the mirror too many times not to recognize it." Silence. Then came the offer. So unexpected it didn't feel real. "Let me pay for the treatment, all of it. No interest, no strings." Emily blinked. Her throat tightened. "Why would you do that?" she asked, voice flat, arms folded. Lucas studied her face for a long moment before replying. "Because I can." That answer should have enraged her. It sounded arrogant, transactional. But it didn't. Not the way he said it. There was something else in it, a weariness that went deeper than pride. She shook her head. "I don't want pity. It's not pity," Lucas replied. "It's a deal." She raised an eyebrow. "A deal?" He took a slow breath. "1 week. You come to my home, help me redesign it, not just furniture or walls, make it feel alive, fill it with flowers, warmth, and maybe cook." Emily scoffed. "Cook?" He smiled faintly. 3 meals a day, you choose. I'll eat whatever you make. But I want to know what real tastes like. For once. She stared at him. "So you want a personal chef? And a florist?" "I want a person who isn't afraid to say no to me. Someone who doesn't care about my name." Emily's mind reeled. The audacity, the absurdity, the temptation. She should have walked away, should have told him that no amount of money or sympathy could buy her. But then she thought of Oliver, his small hand squeezing hers in that hospital bed, his voice trying to sound strong even when he was in pain. And she realized this wasn't about her pride anymore. This was about saving the only family she had left. That night, Emily sat alone on a city bench outside the hotel, tears silently slipping down her cheeks. She didn't believe in fate. But this didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like the beginning of something she hadn't asked for, something impossible to walk away from. By morning, she sent him a one-word reply: deal. It all began on a Monday morning, just after sunrise. Emily stepped out of the elevator and into Lucas Grant's penthouse, the top floor of a glass tower in Manhattan. The space she walked into didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum, or rather, a beautifully lit glass cage. Marble floors, minimalist furniture. Everything was sleek, immaculate, untouched. But what made Emily uneasy wasn't the luxury. It was the absence of life. No family photos, no half-read books, not even a forgotten coffee mug. It was all too perfect, too sterile. Lucas appeared down the hall, still in his usual tailored suit, but today without a tie. "You're early," he said, his voice calm. Emily offered a small smile. "I wanted to see the place before the day swallowed it." He gestured toward the living room. "Make yourself at home. Or, make it into one. That's what you're good at, isn't it?" That afternoon, Emily returned, with flowers. Not fancy arrangements from a luxury boutique, but simple hand-picked blooms from her favorite street vendor. White peonies, daisies, a branch of silvery eucalyptus. She placed them in a clay vase, slightly uneven, handmade, and set it in the center of his cold glass dining table. For the first time, something truly alive disrupted the room's symmetry. That night, she cooked. Not steak, not French cuisine, just roast chicken with lemon, garlic, and thyme, the kind of dish that smelled like memories. Lucas took one bite. Paused. "Tastes like..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he kept eating. The next few days formed an unexpected rhythm. Emily brought more flowers, planted herbs on the balcony, moved the furniture slightly, respectfully. She didn't redesign the penthouse. She softened it. In the mornings, she played soft jazz. In the evenings, she lit candles. Not expensive ones, but simple soy wax candles that smelled of cedar and orange peel. Lucas, a man who usually lived between phone calls and contracts, found himself spending more time in the kitchen. Not working. Just watching. One afternoon, he asked, "Why flowers?" She looked up while trimming stems. "Because they only live a few days. But sometimes, a few days is enough to make someone smile." He went quiet. And then, he smiled. Not the kind worn at galas or in boardrooms. A real smile. Soft, honest, born from something simple. On the fourth day, Emily noticed a locked door at the end of the hallway. She didn't ask. But Lucas noticed that she'd seen it. The next morning, the door was open. It was a library, or used to be. Dusty shelves, unopened boxes, a guitar case in the corner. On the desk, a photo, a woman, brown hair, laughing, holding a baby. Emily didn't ask. She didn't need to. That afternoon, she brought in a seat cushion, placed a small vase of lavender on the desk. She didn't move the photo. She simply allowed the room to breathe again. That morning, Emily handed Lucas a cup of coffee in a chipped ceramic mug she had brought from home. He held it like it was something precious. "You know," he said quietly, "this place never smelled like anything before. Now, it smells like you." She looked at him. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't charm. It was truth. From a man who, perhaps for the first time, was truly healing. And maybe, so was she. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening. The city below buzzed with its usual rhythm, the sky stained in golden hues as the sun dipped beneath the skyline. Emily had just finished placing a small vase of fresh tulips in the corner of Lucas's library, a room that had become unexpectedly sacred between them. But that calm didn't last. That evening, over coffee with a former colleague from her first event planning job, an offhand remark shattered everything. "You remember that tiny restaurant your parents had near Elm Street?" the woman said casually, stirring her drink. "Got swallowed up in that redevelopment project years ago. LG Holdings took over the whole block." Emily froze. "What did you say?" "Yeah, Lucas Grant's company. Bought it all out. Built that lifestyle plaza on top. You didn't know?" The words hit her like a slap in the dark, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She didn't call ahead, didn't wait for morning. Emily marched into the penthouse that night with fire in her eyes. Lucas turned from the window, startled by the sound of the door. "Emily?" His voice was soft, but she didn't answer. Not yet. She dropped her bag on the floor, looked him square in the eyes. "Did you know?" she asked, voice low but vibrating with restrained fury. "That your company bulldozed my family's restaurant? That you erased my childhood for a parking garage and a juice bar?" Lucas's brow furrowed, confusion clouding his face. "What are you talking about?" She stepped closer, the pain rising in her chest. "My parents' place. We lost everything. I was 16. They never recovered. And now here I am, redecorating the home of the man whose empire helped destroy mine." Lucas paled. Emily, I didn't know. I handle hundreds of acquisitions every year. I don't—" "And that's the problem," she snapped. "You didn't know. You didn't care. To you it was just another deal, another square foot of profit. But to me, it was home." He tried to speak, but she raised her hand to stop him. "You've been feeding me comfort, care, flowers, smiles, as if any of it means something, as if I should be grateful. But you never once looked at who I was, where I came from, what you'd taken." Her voice cracked. "You took my memories, and now you want to give me flowers in return?" Lucas stood still. No rebuttal, no defense. Because the worst part was that she was right. He couldn't remember the acquisition, couldn't remember the name of the restaurant, couldn't remember the family that lost everything. He had erased something sacred, without even knowing it. And now he was the one standing in silence, surrounded by warmth he hadn't earned. Emily turned away, her shoulders trembling, not from embarrassment, not this time, from real, bone-deep hurt. Without another word, she walked out the door. This time, she didn't look back. It arrived on a rainy Thursday, the kind of rain that didn't pour or crash, but whispered. It tapped gently on window panes, streamed quietly down rooftops, and lingered like a memory too soft to ignore. Emily had just returned from the hospital. Her coat still dripped from the walk home, her boots left muddy prints on the worn rug, and her shoulders sagged beneath a weight she hadn't named, but felt constantly. She noticed the envelope the moment she shut the door. It was resting on the entry table where she normally tossed her keys. It hadn't been there that morning. No courier knock, no mail slot click. Just there. Plain. No markings. No return address. Just her name, Emily Rivera, written in delicate cursive. Ink black. Familiar. Her fingers hesitated. The air around her felt heavier, like the walls were holding their breath. She placed her keys down, sat slowly at the edge of the dining chair, and stared at the envelope as if it might vanish if she blinked too hard. When she finally opened it, the sound of tearing paper was the only thing audible in the quiet apartment. Inside, no letter, no note, just a set of official documents, neatly clipped together. Emily unfolded them. Title transfer agreement property, 413 Maple Street, formerly Rivera Family Kitchen, transferred from Grant Holdings, Inc. New owner, Emily Rivera. At the bottom of the final page, where one might expect paragraphs of legal jargon or conditions, there was nothing except for a single handwritten signature. L. Grant. No message, no, I'm sorry, no, I hope this helps. Just a name, and yet it said everything. Emily sat in silence for a long while. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, she didn't even move. The rain whispered on the windows behind her, and the ticking of the old clock above the stove suddenly sounded like thunder. This was not restitution. It wasn't guilt money, or some rich man's attempt to rewrite history. It was more human than that. Lucas hadn't tried to explain. He hadn't sent flowers. No poetic apology, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet act, an undoing of harm as much as something like this could ever be undone. And somehow, that made it more real. Emily's eyes drifted across the room, over the chipped ceramic vase still holding a wilting bunch of daisies, over the stack of hospital bills tucked under a cookbook, over to the corner of the table where Oliver had drawn with crayons the night before. His stick figures were smiling, always smiling. She thought about the restaurant. She could still remember the smell of her father's garlic bread on Friday nights, the way her mother hummed while chopping herbs, the way her little hands had barely reached the counter when she first started helping. That place wasn't just a building. It was the last time she remembered feeling whole. And now, without a word, it was hers again. Her hand drifted to the corner of the document where Lucas's signature sat, still slightly smudged. She traced the letters with her thumb, as if touching the ink could somehow touch him too. Not the CEO, not the stranger, but the man who had sat across from her over coffee, the man who listened more than he spoke, the man who had once asked, "What makes you smile?" This, not the gift, but the silence behind it. It wasn't a cry for attention, it wasn't pride, it was a man stepping back, leaving something at her door without needing to be seen. It was closure, or maybe an opening. And in that quiet, as the rain slowed and a golden light broke faintly through the clouds, Emily exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like something was missing. She felt seen. And though she didn't know what would come next, she knew this. The past wasn't hers to forget. But the future, starting now, was finally hers to choose. It had been 3 days since Emily opened the envelope with her name on it and the deed to her family's restaurant inside. 3 days of silence, of wandering through familiar streets with unfamiliar thoughts, of late-night walks around the block that ended back at the same door, with the same unanswered ache in her chest. She didn't call ahead. She didn't plan what to say. She just knew that if she didn't go now, she might never go. The elevator ride up to Lucas's penthouse felt eternal. Not because of the height, but because of the weight she carried, fear, doubt, and something far more dangerous, hope. When the doors opened, she found herself standing in front of his apartment again, the same place where she had once felt like an outsider. Now, she wasn't sure what she was. She didn't knock. Not right away, but just as she raised her hand, the door opened. He was there. Lucas, standing barefoot in soft gray slacks and a dark sweater. His sleeves were pushed to his elbows, his hair a little messy, like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. There were dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept, like he'd been waiting. He didn't say a word. Neither did she. And then, slowly, Emily stepped forward, crossing the threshold without asking. She stood in front of him, just inches away. Her breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling with quiet urgency, Then, without a word, she leaned in and hugged him. No mistakes this time, no confusion, no apology. She simply wrapped her arms around his body and held him, as if this was the only place that had ever made sense. Lucas froze for half a heartbeat, as though he wasn't sure if he was dreaming. But then, with a deep breath, he responded. His arms closed around her, pulling her in. One hand rested protectively on the small of her back. The other slid to the back of her head, his fingers gently weaving through her hair. He held her like a man who'd been holding his breath for too long. "I don't know what this is going to be," Emily said finally, her voice muffled against his chest. "I don't have answers. I'm still mad, still confused, but I'm here, because I don't want to keep running from something that feels this real." Lucas lowered his chin, resting it gently against her head. His eyes closed for a moment, his lips parting as though trying to release the tension that had lived in his chest for weeks. "You came back," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I needed to," she said. "Not because of what you gave me, but because of how you gave it." He pulled back slightly, just enough to see her face. Her eyes were wet, but not from sadness. They shimmered with something tender, something terrifying. "I didn't do it to earn anything," he said softly. "I did it because it was yours, and because giving it back felt like the first honest thing I've done in a long time." They stood there for a while. No rush, no expectation. The air in the room had changed, no longer sterile, no longer filled with unsaid things. Now it was warm, fragile, human. Emily looked around and noticed something different. There were flowers in the vase she had left behind. Still fresh, still cared for. The kitchen light was on. A single place set at the table, with a napkin folded just the way she did it. Lucas followed her gaze and smiled, just faintly. "I never moved them," he said. "Didn't have the heart to." She exhaled, something catching in her throat. "This doesn't fix everything," she said gently. "I know. We're still a mess." "We are," he nodded. "But maybe we can figure it out. Together." Lucas stepped closer again, his voice steady now. "Just tell me you're not going anywhere tonight." "I'm not." He reached for her hand, held it like it was something delicate, something sacred. And in that quiet moment, the past didn't matter as much. What mattered was this. The space between them was no longer filled with fear, but with choice. The choice to stay. The choice to try. The choice to begin again, even after the fall. Outside, the city pulsed with its own rhythm. But in that apartment, in the soft lighting and the lingering scent of flowers and home-cooked meals long gone, a new story was beginning. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. It started with a photo. A single image, taken from behind a column of marble at a gala, Emily standing beside Lucas, her hand resting lightly on his arm, both smiling, unaware. By morning, it was everywhere. From florals to fortune, who is the woman beside Lucas Grant? The event planner and the empire heir, a Cinderella story or something else? Insider sources say she's no stranger to strategic attachments. Emily hadn't seen it coming. At first, it was a flurry of curiosity. Harmless headlines, Instagram reels speculating about her wardrobe, anonymous accounts analyzing her smile. But then it turned sharp. Ugly. Someone unearthed old photos of her floral installations in modest neighborhood weddings. They called her ambitious, then calculating, then worse. The name Avery Hale entered the chat. An ex of Lucas, CEO of a luxury design conglomerate and a media darling. Blonde, brilliant, ruthless. She didn't attack Emily directly, at least not at first. But she did appear on a podcast 2 days later, her voice smooth as satin. I just think we should always ask, what's the real intention when someone enters a world they never belonged to? The internet didn't need much more. Suddenly, Emily became a symbol. Not of love, not of resilience, but of every woman some people resented for climbing too far. Her inbox flooded. So did her DMs. Gold digger. Fraud. Nothing but a distraction. The weight of it pressed on her like a silent avalanche. She stopped opening her laptop. She stopped picking up calls. Even arranging flowers, once her sanctuary, felt hollow. I can't do this, she whispered to herself one morning, staring at the empty vase on her kitchen counter. I'm not built for this kind of storm. Then came the press conference. No one had expected Lucas Grant, infamously private, chronically allergic to media, to step onto a stage in front of cameras. But he did. Dark suit, no tie, tired eyes. He stood at the podium as flashes popped and journalists leaned forward, hungry for another quote to dissect. Lucas cleared his throat, paused, then looked straight into the lens. You want to talk about me, my company, or my deals? Go ahead. But if you're here to talk about her, then listen closely. A breath. I've had power. I've had wealth. I've sat in rooms where people nodded because they feared me. But not one of them ever looked at me, truly looked at me, the way she has. Another pause. This time longer, softer. Emily didn't need me. That's what makes this real. I need her. Because for the first time, someone wasn't impressed. They were honest. The room fell into stunned silence. No one clapped. No one blinked because they felt it. Not a defense. Not a PR strategy. But truth. Bare, unfiltered, and terrifying in its vulnerability. Months had passed, and the old restaurant where Emily had spent her childhood no longer stood as a ruin of the past. The once cracked walls had been repainted in soft, earthy tones. The moss-covered roof was replaced, but preserved a few old tiles, left intentionally, like memories too important to erase. A wooden sign, once weathered by wind and time, now hung proudly at the front. It bore no words, only the image of a wildflower, the same symbol Emily used in her event designs. The whole space breathed a quiet mix of nostalgia and new beginnings. Lucas hadn't hired a renovation crew. He wanted to help, by hand. And Emily let him, not because she needed it, but because, for the first time, she saw him stay. Every evening after work, he showed up. Jacket off, sleeves rolled, paint on his hands. He learned how to saw without cutting himself, how to arrange chairs in a way that made the space feel not just functional, but warm. He didn't talk much. He just worked and stayed. That night, the small garden behind the restaurant smelled of freshly cut grass and lavender, planted by Emily that very morning. Soft, golden string lights were hung above, casting a warm glow across a long wooden table they'd assembled just hours earlier. Everything was still unfinished, but to Emily, it was already perfect. She sat on the doorstep, knees hugged to her chest, tired but at peace. The lights painted a golden outline on her cheekbones and hair. Lucas approached slowly, carrying a small velvet box in one hand. Emily looked up. She already knew, but something in her still paused as he opened the box. Inside lay a ring, not the kind that sparkled like in the movies. It was simple, delicate, set with a small smoky gray stone, unpolished like it had been plucked from a riverbank. And yet, there was something unmistakably real about it. Lucas didn't kneel. He just sat beside her, voice low and steady, like he was speaking to the quiet loneliness that had lived inside him for years. I can't promise I'll always get it right. I can't promise I'll never hurt you. But I will learn. Learn to stay. learn not to run. I won't walk ahead of you to lead, or behind to catch you when you fall. I just want to walk beside you, every day, every night, in every moment you'll let me. Emily didn't cry right away. She just looked at him. A long look, as if peering into a man who used to be frozen, now slowly thawing. Finally, she extended her hand. No words. Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. There were no cheers, no fireworks, no petals falling from the sky, only the scent of wood, the hum of summer insects, and the soft glow of golden light illuminating two people who had both known heartbreak, yet now chose to stay side by side. On a gentle morning where time itself seemed to slow, the backyard of Emily's old family restaurant was dressed not in luxury, but in memory. Burlap ribbons hung loosely along a rustic wooden fence. Tables and chairs were draped in simple white cloths. Down the center aisle, dried lavender petals lay scattered. Lavender, the first flower Emily ever planted in the back garden. Her father's old wooden chair, lovingly repaired, sat in the front row. No one sat in it. It was reserved for those who couldn't be present, but whose presence was felt deeply in the heart. There were no violins playing as Emily walked out. Only the soft chirping of morning birds, the whisper of wind through leaves, and the giggles of neighborhood children, invited simply because they used to wave to Emily every morning on her way to work. Lucas didn't wear a suit, just a white linen shirt, sleeves casually rolled. His hair wasn't perfectly styled, but something was different. He smiled, not out of politeness, but from something real. Emily wore no dramatic wedding gown, just a short, square-neck lace dress with soft puffed sleeves, the kind she would have designed for someone else's wedding. But this time, it was hers. Her younger brother Oliver, thin but glowing with pride, walked her down the aisle. He didn't cry, but his voice cracked as he gave her away. The one officiating the ceremony was the elderly baker from across the street, who once let Emily buy bread on credit when her family had nothing. There were no grand vows, no declarations of eternal love beneath a chapel ceiling. Lucas simply said, "I used to think the world only respected the strong, but you taught me, sometimes all it takes is someone who chooses to stay." Emily looked at him, her voice trembling. "I used to think I was just passing through your world, but now I know. Where I stand is where we begin." They held hands, not tightly, not desperately, just firmly enough to know, this time neither would let go. As the sun rose higher, their shadows stretched long across the weathered wooden floor, and in that moment, no one remembered the arguments, the heartbreaks, the doubts. They remembered only this: real love doesn't need to arrive at the perfect time. It only needs the right person, willing to stay when every truth has been laid bare. No thunderous applause, no confetti in the air, but the entire garden seemed to exhale. A long, quiet breath, soft and serene, like life itself had just finished a long journey and arrived home. If you've made it this far, leave a comment with the word love to let us know you stayed until the very end, the kind of person who cherishes heartfelt, healing stories like this one. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next emotional journey. What do you think? Can Emily and Lucas hold on to this quiet kind of love in a world that never stops changing? Share your thoughts and feelings with us in the comments below.